The air in the chapel of Pendleton and Sons funeral home was thick with the scent of lilies and old varnish, a combination Arthur Pendleton had associated with solemnity since he was a boy. Now, at 54, the smell was simply the scent of his office. He stood discreetly near the back, his dark suit perfectly pressed, his posture a study in respectful stillness. His gaze swept over the sparse crowd, 3 people. For a man as wealthy as Elias Vance, 3 attendees felt less like an intimate gathering and more like an indictment. There was Marcus Vance, the great-nephew, a man in his late 20s whose suit looked rented and whose foot tapped a nervous rhythm against the polished oak floor. Beside him sat a stern-faced woman in a severe pantsuit, the lawyer, Miss Albright, who had handled all the arrangements with a brisk, impersonal efficiency. The third was an elderly man Arthur didn't recognize, who sat alone in the second row, his back ramrod straight, staring intently at the mahogany casket at the front of the room. It was a beautiful piece, the best in Arthur's showroom, chosen and paid for by Marcus without a moment's hesitation. Arthur found it all a bit theatrical. Mr. Vance had been cremated 3 days ago. The small, heavy brass urn sitting on a velvet-draped pedestal to the left of the pulpit was the man's final, true vessel. But Marcus had insisted on a traditional viewing and service with a closed casket. "It's about the gravitas, you know," he'd said, fumbling with his designer watch. "Uncle Elias was a man of substance. He deserves the full presentation." Arthur hadn't argued. He'd learned long ago that grief, or whatever emotion was at play here, took many forms. If the nephew found comfort in paying for an empty box to be the centerpiece of a funereal stage play, it wasn't his place to question it. He had personally overseen the preparation. The casket was lined with pristine satin, empty save for a small, weighted cushion to prevent any undignified rattling. He had sealed it himself yesterday afternoon. A job done right, like every other job in his 30-year career. Miss Albright was at the pulpit, delivering a eulogy that sounded as if it had been lifted from a corporate mission statement. Elias Vance was a titan of industry, a visionary in logistics. His contributions to the regional economy will be a lasting legacy. Arthur shifted his weight. The chapel was quiet, the only sounds being the lawyer's dry monotone and the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Outside, a persistent drizzle painted gray streaks on the stained glass windows, depicting a serene, pastoral scene that felt a world away from the sterile atmosphere within. He glanced at the casket. The mahogany gleamed under the soft lighting, a silent, imposing monument to a life that, by all accounts, had been lived in solitude. It was then that the silence was broken. It wasn't a cough or a sob. It was a sound so alien to this sacred space that for a moment, Arthur's brain refused to process it. A tinny, upbeat electronic melody. A polyphonic ringtone. BB Beering, a generic chipper tune that belonged in a shopping mall, not a chapel. Heads turned. Marcus stopped his tapping, his face a mask of confusion. Miss Albright paused, her mouth slightly agape, losing her place in her sterile tribute. The old man in the second row leaned forward slightly, cupping a hand to his ear. Arthur's blood ran cold. He scanned the small audience. It wasn't them. The sound was muffled, yet clear. It seemed to be coming from the front of the room. BB Beering, his professional gaze, honed by decades of managing delicate situations, pinpointed the source with a certainty that made his stomach clench. It was impossible. It defied all logic, all protocol, all laws of physics. But the sound was undeniably, horrifyingly, coming from inside the sealed mahogany casket. Arthur's mind raced, desperately searching for a rational explanation. A prank. Had one of his young assistants, in a display of monumental stupidity and cruelty, slipped a phone inside before he sealed it? No, he trusted his staff. He had been the last one to touch it. He remembered placing the lid, the satisfying click of the locking mechanism. It was secure. It was empty. Marcus shot a panicked, accusatory look toward Arthur. "What is that? What in God's name is that?" he whispered, his voice cracking with panic. Miss Albright had gone pale, her professional veneer crumbling. "Mr. Pendleton," she began, her voice barely audible. The ringtone continued its cheerful, relentless assault on the funereal quiet. It felt obscene. Arthur moved, his limbs feeling heavy, his mind a whirlwind of protocol and pure, unadulterated shock. He walked to the front, his steps echoing loudly in the tense silence between the rings. He placed a hand on the casket, as if to quiet it. He could feel the faintest vibration through the polished wood, confirming the nightmare. It was real. "My sincerest apologies," Arthur said, his voice a low, steady baritone he had perfected for moments of crisis. It was a voice designed to reassure, to calm, to take control. But now it felt like a lie. "It appears there has been an unforeseen technical issue, a most regrettable interruption. Please, if you would all step into the reception hall, we will resolve this immediately." He didn't wait for arguments. He gently but firmly guided a trembling Marcus toward the door, with Miss Albright following close behind, looking utterly lost. The old man, however, remained seated for a moment, his gaze fixed on Arthur, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before he slowly rose and followed the others. Arthur closed the heavy chapel doors behind them, the click of the latch sealing him in. He was alone. The ringing had stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was somehow worse. It was heavy, accusatory. He stood there, his heart pounding against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden stillness. His gaze was locked on the casket. 30 years he had worked in this business, upholding the dignity of the departed, providing solace to the living. He had faced inconsolable grief, family disputes, and every tragic circumstance imaginable. But he had never faced this. He knew what was in the urn on the pedestal. He had the certificate of cremation, signed and dated, in a folder in his office. He knew what was supposed to be in the casket, nothing. Yet a phone had rung. A phone needs a person to put it there. A phone needs a person to call it. His mind recoiled from the implications, but his professionalism forced him to confront the immediate problem. He had to know. He couldn't call the police. What would he say? That he, Arthur Pendleton, had somehow misplaced a body. That his crematorium had made a mistake of such epic proportions. His family's name, his life's work would be ruined, turned into a macabre local joke. No, he had to see for himself. He had to understand the impossible thing that had happened in his chapel. He walked to a small sacristy, his legs unsteady, and retrieved the casket key and a small, flat pry bar, just in case. His hands, usually so steady, trembled as he returned to the mahogany box. He stood before it, the tools feeling cold and heavy in his grip. The polished surface reflected his own distorted, pale face. He took a deep breath, the scent of lilies now cloying and suffocating, and prepared to uncover the truth, terrified of what he might find inside. The silence in the chapel was a physical weight. It pressed in on Arthur, heavier than the scent of lilies and polished oak. Each tick of the grandfather clock in the foyer sounded like a hammer blow against his composure. His hands, usually so steady they could suture a delicate wound with artistic precision, trembled slightly as he selected a casket key from the small, velvet-lined box he kept in his office. It was a simple, star-shaped tool, designed for the discreet locking mechanisms of high-end caskets like the one chosen for Elias Vance. Returning to the chapel, he circled the mahogany behemoth. He had overseen its delivery, its preparation. He had personally ensured the satin interior was perfect. His pallbearers had carried it, commenting on its substantial weight. All standard procedure, all a lie. The key slid into the hidden lock near the head of the casket with a soft click. He turned it. A second lock was near the foot. Click. The seals were now disengaged. Arthur took a deep, shuddering breath, the air tasting stale and metallic. He placed his fingertips under the heavy lid, his mind a maelstrom of horrific possibilities. A different body, a grotesque prank? He braced himself, his knuckles white and lifted. The lid rose with a quiet, hydraulic hiss, a sound he'd heard 1,000 times. But what he saw was not the familiar sight of a peacefully reposed body. It wasn't Elias Vance. It wasn't anyone. The casket was filled with sandbags. Dull, beige, canvas sacks, crudely stitched and lumpy, were stacked neatly inside the plush, cream-colored satin. They were the kind you'd find at a hardware store, used for flood prevention or construction. The sheer, banal ugliness of them against the funereal luxury was jarring, an insult to everything Arthur's profession stood for. A wave of nausea, hot and acidic, rose in his throat. He leaned against the casket, his legs suddenly weak. The weight. The pallbearers had been carrying sand. His shock slowly receded, replaced by a cold, sharp anger. This was a desecration, a carefully orchestrated fraud perpetrated in his sanctuary. His gaze scanned the interior again, and then he saw it. Tucked between two of the larger sandbags was the source of the disturbance. A sleek, black smartphone, its screen dark. It lay there, a starkly modern artifact in a sea of morbid deception. Arthur reached in, his fingers closing around the cool glass and metal. It felt alien in his hand. He pressed the side button. The screen flickered to life, displaying a generic nature scene and, in the top corner, a single bar of service and 9% battery. The lock screen showed no notifications, no missed call icon. Strange, the ringing had been so insistent. He swiped up. No passcode. Another oddity for a man of Vance's supposed wealth and secrecy. The home screen was sparse, with only a few basic apps. His mortician's eye for detail took over, the fear being nudged aside by a methodical need to understand. He opened the call log. The last outgoing call was made 3 days ago to a number labeled H. Grable. The last incoming call, however, the one that had rung during the service, wasn't listed. It must have been from an unsaved or blocked number, a dead end. His thumb hovered over the text messages. He tapped the icon. There was only one conversation, with a contact simply named L. The thread contained a series of short, cryptic messages from L over the past week. Is the asset secure? Transfer is pending confirmation. Final arrangements are in motion. No deviations. Arthur's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a bizarre prank, it was a plan, a conspiracy. He scrolled down to the very last message, received just minutes before the funeral began. It was from the same unknown number that had called. It wasn't in the call log, but it had left a text. The message was 4 words: package compromised, abort transfer. Arthur stared at the screen, the words burning into his memory. The package had to be whatever was supposed to be in this casket. The transfer, Vance's fortune, and abort, the call was a warning. A warning to whom? The person who was supposed to be at this funeral but wasn't, or to someone else involved in the scheme. He sank onto the front pew, the phone clutched in his hand. The implications crashed down on him. Elias Vance wasn't cremated. He wasn't in the urn on the pedestal. He was missing. This entire funeral was a sham, a piece of theater to convince the world he was dead. And Arthur Pendleton, owner of Pendleton and Sons Funeral Home, had been made the unwilling stage manager. His first instinct was to call the police. It was the proper, lawful thing to do. He could already picture the scene. Flashing blue and red lights painting his stained glass windows, uniformed officers tramping over his manicured lawns, his business sealed with yellow tape. The headlines would be a nightmare. Local funeral home at center of bizarre hoax. His family's name, pristine for 3 generations, would be dragged through the mud. He'd be investigated, his license suspended, his reputation, the bedrock of his livelihood, shattered beyond repair. He looked from the phone to the casket full of sandbags. He thought of his father, who taught him that their work was a sacred trust. "We are the quiet guardians of a family's final dignity, Arthur," he used to say. "Our integrity is all we have." What would his father do? He wouldn't panic. He would be methodical. He would protect the family name. A new resolve hardened within him. The people who did this used his funeral home, his reputation, as a tool. They had violated his trust and made him a pawn in their game. The police would see him as a suspect or a fool. These conspirators, whoever L and the caller were, saw him as insignificant, a detail to be managed. They were wrong. He was not just a mortician. He was an expert in details, in secrets, in maintaining a calm facade while managing chaos. The skills he used to comfort grieving families were the same ones he could use to unravel this. Discretion, observation, a deep understanding of how people behaved in the face of death. He stood up, his decision made. He would not call the police, not yet. First, he would understand. He slipped the phone into his jacket pocket. He walked back to the casket and gently lowered the lid, the hiss of the hydraulics sounding like a secret being sealed. He turned the key in both locks. To the outside world, nothing had changed. But for Arthur, everything had. The funeral for Elias Vance was over. His own investigation had just begun. The sterile quiet of the preparation room was a familiar comfort, but tonight it felt different. It was the quiet of a vacuum, the silence that follows a detonation. Arthur stood before the open casket, the coarse burlap of the sandbags, a jarring contrast to the plush satin lining. The weight of the situation, heavier than the sand itself, settled onto his shoulders. This wasn't just a professional problem anymore, it was a criminal conspiracy, and he was standing at its epicenter. The Pendleton and Sons name, polished over 3 generations, was now tethered to a lie. His first priority was containment. The evidence had to disappear. The casket, a high-end mahogany model from the Charleston Casket Company, was a liability. Leaving it out for trash collection was unthinkable. It would be like leaving a signed confession on the curb. Calling the manufacturer to return a damaged unit was equally risky. Questions would be asked. No, this required the same meticulous hands-on approach he applied to his trade, just repurposed for a darker task. He worked through the night, a silent, methodical specter in his own funeral home. First, the sandbags. He hauled them one by one, the strain pulling at the muscles in his back and shoulders, to the unmarked gray utility van parked in the garage. The rhythmic grunts of his exertion were the only sounds, swallowed by the thick, humid South Carolina air. He then turned to the casket itself. With a set of professional-grade tools, he began to dismantle it. The soft pop of the hinges, the whine of the electric screwdriver removing the handles, the splintering crack as he pried the lid from its base. Each sound felt like a desecration of his life's work. He was unmaking something, piece by piece, just as his professional world had been unmade in a matter of hours. By 2 a.m., the casket was reduced to a neat pile of polished wood planks, satin lining, and brass fittings. He loaded everything into the van, carefully arranging it under a heavy canvas tarp. He changed out of his suit and into a simple dark polo shirt and slacks, a man preparing for a mundane task, not the erasure of a felony. He drove out of the city, heading west, away from the historic downtown and the sleeping residential streets. The city lights faded in his rearview mirror, replaced by the dark, looming shapes of live oaks draped in Spanish moss along the highway. He found what he was looking for on a back road near the Ashley River, a large, semi-official dump site used by local construction crews. Under the dim glow of a single, flickering sodium lamp, he unloaded the sandbags, their contents spilling out to join the mounds of dirt and debris. They were anonymous now, their purpose fulfilled. The casket pieces required more finesse. He drove for another hour, stopping at 3 different commercial dumpsters behind darkened strip malls, depositing a few pieces of wood here, the brass handles there, the satin lining in a third. It was a dispersal, a deliberate scattering of the evidence until it was nothing more than disconnected refuse. As he drove back towards Charleston, the first hint of dawn was bruising the eastern sky. He felt a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, but also a sliver of control. He had cleaned the slate. The physical evidence was gone. Back in the sanctuary of his office, with a cup of strong, black coffee in hand, he turned his attention to the only clue he had left. The phone. He powered it on, the screen illuminating his tired face. The call log was sparse, but the contact list had a single entry that wasn't just a number. H. Grable. It was a starting point. He sat at his mahogany desk, the familiar scent of wood polish and old paper a small comfort, and opened his laptop. He needed to know more about Elias Vance. The intake form, filled out by the man who claimed to be Vance's nephew, listed his occupation as antiquities and historical consultant. A vague but useful detail. A simple search for H. Grable, Charleston, SC, yielded a smattering of public records, too many Henrys, Hannahs, and Howards to be useful. But when he refined the search, H. Grable Antiquities Charleston, the results narrowed dramatically. One name stood out: Helen Grable, Chief Archivist at the Charleston Library Society, an institution as old and respected as his own. According to her online staff profile, her specialty was pre-Civil War maritime ledgers and artifacts. It was a perfect intersection with an antiquities dealer. The connection felt solid, tangible. Arthur leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in the silent office. He couldn't simply walk in and accuse the chief archivist of a venerable institution of being part of a criminal conspiracy. He needed a pretext, a key to unlock the door without her knowing he was there to rob the place of its secrets. His own life, his own profession, gave him the answer. He was a man steeped in history, in lineage, in the careful documentation of lives lived and ended. He would become what so many of his clients were, a man searching for his roots. He would visit the Charleston Library Society. He would request access to the archives for a genealogical project, a search for a fictitious ancestor who supposedly arrived in Charleston by sea in the early 1800s. It was a plausible, respectable cover. It would put him in her orbit. It would allow him to observe, to listen, to gauge her reaction to the name Elias Vance when he eventually, carefully, let it drop. As the sun finally crested the horizon, casting long shadows across his office, Arthur felt a shift within him. The mortician's quiet grief was being replaced by the investigator's cold resolve. He had a name. He had a location. He had a plan. The next phase had begun. The Charleston Library Society was an island of scholarly silence adrift in the sea of the city's humid, vibrant life. Arthur felt the transition acutely as he stepped from the sun-drenched cobblestones of King Street into the cool, hallowed interior. The air inside, thick with the scent of aged paper and leather binding, was a world away from the metallic sterility of his preparation room. He straightened his tie, the simple knot feeling like a component of a costume. He was no longer Arthur Pendleton, mortician. He was Arthur Pendleton, amateur genealogist, a role he had rehearsed in his mind with the same precision he applied to suturing an incision. He approached the main desk, a formidable structure of dark, polished wood. A young woman with bright, inquisitive eyes looked up from a book. "Can I help you, sir?" "Yes," Arthur said, his voice a practiced, gentle baritone. "I'm hoping to speak with Miss Helen Grable. I was told she's the chief archivist and the person to see regarding historical family records." The young woman smiled. "You were told correctly. She's the best. Let me see if she's available." She picked up a telephone, her voice dropping to a murmur. A moment later, she hung up. "She can see you through those double doors, and it's the third office on the left." Arthur gave a nod of thanks and proceeded, his leather-soled shoes making soft, respectful sounds on the floorboards. He found the door, the name H.Grable, Chief Archivist, elegantly printed on a small brass plaque. He knocked twice. "Come in," a voice called, crisp and clear. He opened the door to a space that was less an office and more a meticulously organized fortress of knowledge. Bookshelves lined every wall, filled with bound volumes and archival boxes. In the center sat a large oak desk, and behind it, a woman who seemed perfectly matched to her surroundings. Helen Grable was perhaps in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent features framed by silver hair pulled back in a severe but elegant bun. She wore simple, dark-rimmed glasses, and her gaze, as she looked up at him, was direct and analytical. She was appraising him. "Mr. Pendleton?" she asked, though it wasn't a question. "Please have a seat. What can I help you with?" Arthur sat in the chair opposite her, placing his hands on his knees. He began his performance. "Thank you for seeing me, Miss Grable. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I'm from just outside the city." I've recently taken an interest in my family history, and some preliminary research suggests I may have an ancestor who was active here in Charleston during the Reconstruction era. He explained the fabricated details of his great-great-grandfather, a supposed merchant who had fallen on hard times after the Civil War. He kept the story simple, plausible, and peppered with just enough uncertainty to make his need for an expert plausible. Helen listened without interruption, her fingers steepled before her. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of professional neutrality. "Pendleton," she mused, tapping a long, slender finger against her chin. "The name is familiar, but not prominent in the merchant circles of that period. What sort of records were you hoping to find?" "Anything, really," Arthur said, affecting a tone of hopeful amateurism. "Deeds, business ledgers, letters. I was told the society holds extensive private collections from that time." "We do," she confirmed, her eyes never leaving his. "But it's a vast collection. Without a more specific lead, it would be like searching for a single grain of rice in a silo." This was the critical phase. He had to pivot. He needed to introduce Vance's name without shattering the fragile artifice he'd constructed. He leaned forward slightly, adopting a confidential tone. "I understand completely. It's just this new hobby has become a bit of an obsession. I've been reading everything I can. I was even speaking with a local antiquities dealer before his unfortunate passing. A Mr. Vance, Elias Vance. He dealt in historical documents and was quite knowledgeable. He's the one who suggested my search might be more fruitful here." He watched her. He watched her the way he watched grieving families, looking for the minute cracks in their composure, the subtle tells of unspoken emotion. For a fraction of a second, he saw it. A flicker. Her posture didn't change, but her stillness became rigid. The professional mask was still there, but behind it, the mechanism had frozen. Her blink was a beat too slow, her breath held for a moment too long. "Mr. Vance," she said, and her voice was different. It was still crisp, but the warmth, what little there had been, was gone. It was now the flat, brittle sound of glass. "Yes, he was a patron of the library, a tragic, sudden loss." She looked down at a paper on her desk, a clear move to break eye contact. The connection was made. She knew she was involved. Arthur pressed, gently. He had mentioned he was consulting with you about some documents from that same period. I was hoping you might recall what he was looking at. It might give me a place to start." Helen's gaze snapped back up to his, and it was sharp, suspicious. "Mr. Vance's research was confidential, as is that of all our patrons. I'm afraid I can't discuss the specifics of his work." The door was closing. He had to get something before it sealed shut. "Of course, I understand completely. Professional discretion," Arthur said, nodding in sympathy. "I wouldn't dream of asking you to compromise that." He paused, then played his final card. "It's just that my supposed ancestor's business was based near the old Gadsden Wharf. I thought perhaps if Mr. Vance was looking at shipping manifests or something similar." He let the sentence hang in the air. He had given her an out, a way to help him without admitting to anything. Her mind seemed to be working rapidly behind those intelligent eyes. She was weighing the risk of helping this stranger against the risk of having him continue to probe. After a long, tense silence, she seemed to reach a decision. "The wharf, you say?" she said slowly, her professional demeanor returning, though it now felt forced. "There is one collection that might be of interest. It's rarely requested. The Gadsden Wharf Shipping Ledger from 1865. It details cargo transfers immediately following the end of the war. Mr. Vance did consult it recently." She said it as if it were a minor concession, a simple fact. But to Arthur, it was a confession. "That sounds incredibly promising," Arthur said, trying to contain the surge of adrenaline. "The package transfer from the text message. It couldn't be a coincidence. Would it be possible for me to see it?" "It's a fragile document," she said, her voice firm, protective. "It requires supervised viewing in our special collections room. You can make an appointment at the front desk. They will inform you of the handling procedures." She stood up, a clear signal that the meeting was over. "Miss Grable, thank you. You've been immensely helpful," Arthur said, rising as well. "It's my job, Mr. Pendleton," she replied, her face once again an unreadable mask. He walked out of her office and back through the main library, the quiet hum of the building now feeling charged with secrets. He stepped back out into the oppressive Charleston heat, the humidity clinging to him instantly. He had done it. He had faced the first accomplice and walked away not only unscathed, but with a new lead. A solid lead. A 19th century shipping ledger. The key to this entire conspiracy, he felt with chilling certainty, was hidden in a book of the dead. Arthur left the library with a forced placidity that masked the storm brewing within him. Helen Grable's nervous energy had been a beacon, confirming his suspicions but offering little else. Now, he had a tangible thread. The Gadsden Wharf shipping ledger, 1865. He walked down King Street, the afternoon sun casting long shadows from the ornate ironwork balconies. The air was thick with humidity and the faint scent of jasmine, a sweet perfume that did nothing to calm his nerves. He felt exposed, a man of shadows suddenly thrust into the light. He couldn't just walk back in and demand the ledger. Helen had made that clear. An institution like the Charleston Library Society ran on procedure, on appointments and request forms. It was a bureaucracy designed for patience, a quality Arthur possessed in spades, but which now felt like a lead weight. He went home, to the quiet solitude of the apartment above the funeral parlor. He sat at his mahogany desk, the same one his father had used, and pulled up the library's website. The online form for accessing special collections was straightforward, clinical. He filled it out meticulously, requesting the Gadsden Wharf shipping ledger, 1865, citing continued genealogical research into 19th century maritime trade impacting my family's ancestral lines. It was a lie, but a plausible, dry one. He submitted the request and received an automated reply. A staff member would be in touch within 2 business days to schedule an appointment. 2 days. It felt like an eternity. For 48 hours, Arthur went through the motions of his life. He comforted a grieving widow, arranged the transport of a body from a local hospital, and polished the brass fittings on the chapel doors. But his mind was elsewhere, circling the name Elias Vance and the guarded expression on Helen Grable's face. He replayed their conversation, dissecting every word, every flicker of her eyes. She was scared, and her fear, more than anything, convinced Arthur that he was on the right path. The email arrived on the second day. His appointment was scheduled for the following afternoon in the Special Collections reading room. The name at the bottom of the email was not Helen Grable, but a Mr. Alastair Finch, senior archivist. A part of Arthur was relieved. He wouldn't have to face Helen's anxious gaze again. Another part was apprehensive. A new player meant a new variable, an unknown observer in this quiet, dangerous game. The next day, Arthur arrived at the library precisely on time. He was directed to a different part of the building, a hushed, climate-controlled room with only a few large oak tables. The air smelled of old paper and lemon oil. Mr. Finch was a tall, thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a posture as rigid as the spines of the books lining the walls. He spoke in low, measured tones. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, without a handshake. "The Gadsden Wharf ledger. A fascinating choice." He gestured to a table where the enormous, leather-bound book lay open in a foam cradle. "You'll find cotton gloves here. Please use them. No pens, only the provided pencils and paper. You have 2 hours." Finch sat at a desk in the corner of the room, ostensibly working on his own papers, but Arthur could feel the man's gaze on him. It was the detached, professional watchfulness he himself used in the embalming room, an unnerving parallel. He pulled on the thin, white cotton gloves, the sensation foreign on his fingertips. He took a seat and looked down at the ledger. It was a beautiful, imposing object. The leather cover was cracked and worn, the corners softened by time. The pages were thick, fibrous rag paper, covered in elegant, looping cursive written in iron gall ink that had faded from black to a rusty brown. Each entry was a tiny story: dates, ship names, captains, cargo, and consignees. Bales of cotton, barrels of rice, crates of indigo, the lifeblood of a city rebuilding itself after the devastation of the Civil War. Arthur started with January, his gloved finger tracing the lines of script. The task felt monumental. He had no idea what he was looking for. A name? A company? He scanned for Vance or Grable, knowing it was a long shot. The hours ticked by on the grandfather clock in the hall outside, its solemn chime marking the quarter hour. He moved through the pages, a methodical rhythm taking over. Ship after ship, cargo after cargo. The Palmetto Pride, the Sea Raven, the Charleston Belle. Nothing. His allotted time was dwindling. Finch hadn't moved, a silent sentinel in Arthur's periphery. Frustration began to prickle at the edges of his composure. This was a fool's errand. Helen had sent him on a wild goose chase to get rid of him. He was about to close the book, to concede defeat, when a name in the August section snagged his attention. The ship was the Serafina, out of Liverpool. Its manifest was mostly standard: textiles, machinery, finished goods. But at the bottom, one entry was different. It was smaller, almost an addendum. Cargo, personal effects, 1 crate, unclaimed. Consignee, C. Devereux. Devereux. The name resonated with Arthur, a low hum of recognition from deep within his professional memory. The Devereux family was Charleston royalty, their lineage stretching back centuries. They were cotton and shipping magnates who had transitioned seamlessly into modern finance and real estate. Their name was on buildings, on university wings, on philanthropic plaques all over the city. Arthur's own grandfather had handled the funeral for a patriarch, Charles Devereux SR, decades ago. They were a family of immense wealth and influence, but it wasn't just the name. Next to the entry, almost hidden in the tight binding of the spine, was a tiny, hand-drawn mark. It wasn't a doodle or a stray ink blot. It was deliberate. A small, 5-pointed star, precisely inked. It was identical to a small, silver lapel pin Elias Vance had been wearing in the photograph provided for his obituary. Arthur had noted it at the time, thinking it was an alumni pin or some fraternal emblem. He had placed that very pin on the lapel of the empty suit, now buried 6 feet under a slab of granite. A cold certainty washed over him. This was it. This was the connection. An unclaimed crate of personal effects from 1865, consigned to a powerful family, marked with the same symbol Vance wore over a century and a half later. The conspiracy wasn't new, it was ancient. And Elias Vance, the antiquities dealer, hadn't just stumbled upon it. He was a part of it. Arthur's heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silent room. He forced himself to breathe slowly, evenly. He could feel Finch's eyes on him. He couldn't react. He carefully continued turning pages for another 10 minutes, pretending to be absorbed in the mundane shipping details of September and October. He made a few meaningless notes on his provided paper. Finally, with a quiet sigh of feigned scholarly fatigue, he closed the ledger. He stood up and removed the gloves, placing them neatly back on the table. "Thank you, Mr. Finch," Arthur said, his voice a perfect facsimile of a disappointed but grateful researcher. "This was very enlightening, though not quite what I was hoping to find." Finch gave a curt nod. "History is often elusive, Mr. Pendleton. Feel free to make another appointment if you wish to continue." Arthur walked out of the reading room, his steps measured and calm. But as soon as he was back on the sun-drenched Charleston Street, the facade crumbled. The humidity felt suffocating, the city's charming facade suddenly seeming sinister. He hadn't just found a clue, he had stumbled into a hornet's nest. A conspiracy tied to the Devereux family wasn't just a matter of professional ruin. This was something far older and far more dangerous. Arthur left the Charleston Library Society as dusk began to bleed across the sky, smudging the sharp edges of the historic rooftops with hues of lavender and gray. The air, thick with the scent of jasmine and salt marsh, felt heavier now, charged with a menace that hadn't been there an hour ago. The name Devereux echoed in his mind, a 2-syllable incantation that seemed to transform the city around him. The familiar, elegant ironwork of the gates he passed now looked like cages. The stately homes, with their wide piazzas and gaslit lanterns, no longer seemed welcoming but secretive, their windows like watchful eyes. He saw the name on a brass plaque affixed to a restored municipal building, then again on a benefactor's wall at a small park. They were woven into the very fabric of Charleston, their influence as old and deep as the city's foundations. He drove back to the funeral home, the quiet solitude of his family's business, now his only sanctuary. Inside his office, the scent of polish and faint, lingering lilies was a comfort. This was his domain, a world of order, science, and quiet dignity. The chaos he had stumbled into felt like a violation of its core principles. He sat at his father's old mahogany desk, the worn leather of the chair groaning softly, and powered on his computer. The single star from the Ledger and Vance's lapel pin burned in his memory. It was a symbol of connection, a breadcrumb left across a century and a half. Now, he had to follow it into the modern world. His investigation began where all such inquiries did in the 21st century, online. He started with the Devereux family itself: public records, newspaper archives, business registries. His movements were methodical, precise, the same way he would prepare a body for viewing, layer by layer, with meticulous attention to detail. The patriarch was Alastair Devereux, a man in his late 60s with a face that seemed carved from granite, his public persona one of unshakable civic duty and immense wealth. The family's empire was vast and diversified, high-end real estate development that was reshaping the Charleston skyline, a global shipping logistics firm that was a direct, powerful descendant of the Gadsden Wharf operations, and a philanthropic foundation that was the darling of the city's elite. They were untouchable, a fortress of old money and modern power. Arthur felt a knot of cold dread tighten in his stomach. He was a mortician, a man who dealt with endings. These people were masters of legacy, of ensuring their story never ended. What could he possibly do against them? For a moment, he considered deleting everything, destroying the phone, and pretending the casket had simply been empty. A bizarre, costly prank, but he couldn't. The phantom weight of his father's reputation, of the Pendleton and Sons name, pressed on him. He had to see this through. He changed his search parameters. He stopped looking for the family and started looking for Elias Vance's connection to them. He typed Elias Vance and Devereux into every search engine variation he could think of. The results were barren. There were no public business dealings, no shared board memberships, no mention of Vance's antiquities shop in any of the Devereux Foundation's acquisition announcements. It was a dead end. Frustrated, Arthur leaned back, rubbing his tired eyes. He needed a different approach. Discretion was the key to this conspiracy. The connection wouldn't be on paper. It would be in the spaces between the official records. He turned to the society pages, the photo galleries of Charleston's endless galas and charity balls. It was tedious, soul-numbing work, scrolling through hundreds of images of the same smiling faces, the same expensive gowns and tuxedos. He was about to give up for the night when he saw it. The photo was from the annual Preservation Society Gala, held 6 months prior at the Hibernian Hall. In the foreground, Alastair Devereux and his wife were smiling for the camera, the very picture of Charleston royalty. But Arthur's eyes were drawn to the background. Partially obscured by a fluted column and a large floral arrangement, 2 men were engaged in a quiet, intense conversation. One of them, unmistakable even in profile, was Elias Vance. He wasn't smiling. His posture was stiff, his hands gesturing emphatically. The man he was speaking to was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, with a head of dark, fashionably messy hair. He was listening with a look that was a mixture of anxiety and impatience. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. He zoomed in, the pixels distorting but the faces remaining clear enough. He didn't recognize the younger man. He saved the image and opened a new tab, searching for pictures of the Devereux family. He found a recent feature in a local magazine about the family's philanthropic efforts. There he was. The caption identified him as Julian Devereux, Alastair's youngest son. The focus of the investigation snapped into sharp clarity. He wasn't looking for a patriarch, he was looking for the son. Arthur began a new, targeted search on Julian Devereux. The articles he found painted a consistent picture. Julian was the family's artistic scion, the one who eschewed the corporate boardroom for the art gallery. He managed the Devereux Historical Trust, a branch of the family foundation that specialized in acquiring significant cultural and historical artifacts. He was often quoted about the importance of preserving Charleston's heritage, but other, smaller mentions in gossip columns and blogs hinted at a different side. Expensive tastes, a fondness for European sports cars, and a presence at the city's most exclusive, high-stakes poker games. He was the perfect mark, a man with a public passion for antiquities and a private need for cash. Here was the bridge, the link between a respectable antiquities dealer and a powerful, shielded family. It ran straight through the black sheep, the one with the vices. The faked death, the secret package, the historical ledger, it was all beginning to coalesce around Julian. Arthur felt a profound chill. This was no longer an abstract historical puzzle. It was about a living, breathing person who was likely cornered, desperate, and dangerous. He couldn't just call him. He needed to see him to understand his role in this dangerous play. More research revealed that the Devereux Trust was sponsoring a new exhibition at a contemporary art gallery in the French Quarter in 2 days. The event page listed a brief opening address to be delivered by Mr. Julian Devereux. It was an invitation, an opportunity. He looked at his reflection in the dark monitor. The same tired, serious face of Arthur Pendleton, Mortician, looked back, but something had changed. There was a new hardness in his eyes, a resolve he hadn't felt before. He would be there. He would step out from the shadows of his quiet, orderly life and into the bright, treacherous world of the Devereux. He had to know the truth, not just for his own sake, but for the silent legacy of the family name he was sworn to protect. The air inside the Trad Street Gallery was thick with the scent of money, perfume, and oil paint. It clung to Arthur's simple dark suit, a uniform he usually associated with solemnity, not spectacle. Here, surrounded by Charleston's high society, he felt like a ghost at a feast. He moved with the practiced quiet of his profession, his steps measured, his posture unobtrusive. His eyes, however, missed nothing. They swept past abstract canvases and bronze sculptures, past clusters of laughing patrons sipping champagne, settling finally on his target. Julian Devereux stood near a large, unsettling painting of a storm-tossed sea. He was exactly as the photograph suggested. Handsome, impeccably dressed in a tailored linen jacket, with an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He held his glass with a casual grace, the very picture of inherited power. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, undignified rhythm. This was a world of blinding light, a stark contrast to the hushed, shadowed corners where he spent his days. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat to the familiar quiet of the mortuary. But the memory of that casket, filled with sand and deceit, anchored him in place. He had a duty, not to the dead this time, but to the truth. He positioned himself near a pedestal displaying a small, intricate metalwork sculpture, pretending to study its form. It gave him a clear line of sight to Julian, who was now engaged in a hushed, intense conversation with a pale, nervous-looking man in a rumpled suit. This was it. Arthur subtly angled his body, straining to catch their words over the polite murmur of the crowd. "The transfer is a mess," the nervous man hissed, wiping a sheen of sweat from his forehead. Vance going dark was one thing, but leaving the phone, its amateur hour, Julian. "If they open that box," Julian cut him off, his voice a low, dangerous growl that belied his charming facade. "They won't. The mortician is a simple man. He'll sign the certificate and be done with it." Vance got greedy. He wanted a bigger cut to smuggle the ledger out with him. Julian took a sip of champagne, his eyes cold as ice. He thought he could leverage the one thing our family has been searching for since 1865. The proof of our legitimacy, the ledger. The word struck Arthur like a physical blow. It wasn't just about an artifact inside the crate. The crate's record itself was the prize. Vance hadn't been smuggling a treasure. He had been hired to steal the proof of a historical fraud, a document that could rewrite the Devereux family's entire legacy. "What do we do?" the man pleaded. "We proceed. The buyer in Geneva doesn't care how we get it. I have another contact ready to retrieve the ledger from the archives. Helen Grable has been neutralized. A generous donation to the library ensures her silence and transfer. We just need to wait for the heat to die down." Julian clapped the man on the shoulder, a gesture that looked more like a threat than reassurance. "Relax, Henry. Go get a drink. You look like you've seen a ghost." Henry scurried away, and Julian turned his gaze toward the painting, a flicker of something dark and possessive in his eyes. He believed he was untouchable. Arthur felt a cold fury rise within him. He thought of Helen, her career threatened, her life upended by this family's arrogance. He thought of his own name, his legacy, nearly destroyed by their careless crime. He pulled out his phone, the same model as the one from the casket. Shielding the screen with his body, he opened the voice recorder app. This was his one chance. He began to drift, a slow, deliberate orbit around Julian's position. He needed more. He needed a name, a place, something undeniable. As he passed a waiter, he politely took a glass of water, his hand steady despite the tremor in his soul. Julian was now on his phone, his voice a low, clipped murmur. Arthur moved closer, pretending to admire the brushstrokes of the tempestuous sea painting, his own internal storm raging. He was only feet away now. He could hear Julian clearly. "Yes, the new arrangement is set. The Geneva buyer is wired. The ledger will be on a flight out of Savannah by the end of the week. No, Vance is a loose end we no longer need to worry about. He's a dead man, one way or another." It was everything. The buyer, the location, the motive, and the chilling confirmation of Vance's fate. Arthur pressed stop on his recording, the quiet click of the screen lost in the gallery's din. He slipped the phone into his pocket, the small device feeling as heavy as a gravestone. As he turned to leave, his blood ran cold. Julian Devereux was looking directly at him, not at the art beside him, but at him. There was no recognition in his eyes, but something else. A flicker of analytical curiosity, the predatory gaze of a man who notices anything out of place in his domain. Arthur was out of place. For a terrifying second, their eyes locked. Arthur held his breath, expecting a security guard's hand on his shoulder, an accusation. He gave a slight, deferential nod, the kind a man of his station might give to a man of Julian's, and then turned away, forcing himself to walk, not run, toward the exit. Each step was an eternity. The sounds of the party faded behind him as he pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the humid Charleston night. He didn't stop walking until he was blocks away, leaning against the cool brick of an old building, the city's salt-laced air filling his lungs. He had the proof. He held the ruin of the Devereux dynasty in his pocket. Weeks later, Arthur was in his office, polishing a set of silver casket handles. The familiar, meticulous work calmed him. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. On his desk, a folded newspaper lay beside his morning coffee. The headline was stark. DVRAUX heir arrested in historical artifact theft. Federal probe WIDNS. The article detailed an anonymous tip sent to the FBI's art crime team, a digital audio file, and a detailed memo outlining a conspiracy to steal and sell the Gadsden Wharf shipping ledger of 1865. The report mentioned a key witness. Former archivist Helen Grable was cooperating fully with authorities. Julian Devereux's carefully constructed world had been dismantled. His family's legitimacy was not proven, but shattered. Arthur's name was nowhere in the article. Pendleton and Son Funeral Home remained a quiet, respected institution, a sanctuary of peace in the heart of the city. He had exposed the truth without ever stepping into the light. He picked up the silver handle, admiring his reflection in its flawless surface. He was the same man he had always been, Arthur Pendleton, a mortician, a quiet guardian of final dignities, who had, for a brief time, become the keeper of a dangerous secret, and the unlikely agent of justice.